In August 1914, the Western Front did not yet exist. What existed instead was possibility. The flickering hope that this war, like all wars before it, might still be won through maneuver and speed. German commanders believed they could sweep through Belgium and France before autumn turned to winter. Allied generals imagined they could hold defensive lines and counterattack. Both were catastrophically wrong. After the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, something shifted fundamentally. The German Schlieffen Plan had failed. The breakthrough that was supposed to end the war in weeks would not come. So both armies, desperate to avoid encirclement, began racing northward toward the English Channel in what history would call the race to the sea. They were not truly racing to the ocean. They were racing to find an open flank, a vulnerable edge, where one side could sweep around the other and achieve what direct assault could not. But as September turned to November 1914, something unexpected happened. The open flank never came. Instead, week after week of frantic maneuvering produced only an unbroken line of improvised defensive positions, stretching 450 miles from Switzerland to the coast. Trenches that soldiers dug as temporary shelters became permanent fortifications. The mobile warfare that generals had trained for became impossible. And a generation of men discovered they had entered not a war of movement, but a war of attrition that would consume millions of lives and barely shift those lines at all. In August of 1914, the Western Front did not yet exist. What existed instead was possibility. The flickering hope that this war, like all wars before it, might still be won through maneuver and speed. German commanders believed they could sweep through Belgium and France in a matter of weeks, crushing French forces before the British could fully mobilize and the Russians could threaten from the east. This was the essence of the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy refined over decades, now about to meet the unforgiving test of modern warfare. The German invasion began immediately after the declaration of war. On August 4, 1914, German forces crossed into Belgium, and within days they confronted their first major obstacle, the fortress city of Liège. Situated at 50.645 degrees north and 5.57 degrees east, this strategic strongpoint guarded the crucial routes into Belgium and France. What followed between August 4th and August 16th was the Siege of Liège, a brutal introduction to the kind of warfare this conflict would demand. German forces equipped with heavy siege artillery, including the massive Krupp howitzers, pounded the Belgian fortifications with unprecedented firepower. The Belgian garrison fought with desperate courage, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Within 2 weeks, the fortress fell, and the German advance rolled forward into Belgium proper. The rapid German movement through Belgium and into northern France seemed, at first, to vindicate the confidence of the German high command. General Alexander von Schlieffen's plan was working as designed. The German First Army, commanded by General Alexander von Kluck, swept southward with remarkable speed, covering ground that previous military theorists had deemed impossible to traverse so quickly. Yet within weeks, the plan began to unravel. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin across Belgian and French territory. Commanders on both sides struggled with communications across vast distances. The French, contrary to German expectations, did not collapse into chaos. Instead, they regrouped, reorganized, and prepared for a decisive counterattack. That counterattack came in September. Between September 5th and September 12th, 1914, the First Battle of the Marne erupted east of Paris. This engagement shattered the German offensive strategy. The French, reinforced by British forces and bolstered by intelligence about German dispositions, launched attacks that forced the German armies to retreat northward. The race to Paris, which German commanders had expected to conclude their victory, instead became the race away from Paris. The Schlieffen Plan, which had promised victory within weeks, lay in ruins. Neither side had achieved the decisive breakthrough that military doctrine promised. Instead, both armies faced an unexpected crisis. What happens when rapid maneuver warfare fails? The answer emerged in the form of a desperate competition to find an open flank, to discover some weakness in the enemy's position that could still be exploited for advantage. This was the race to the sea, a series of engagements that began in late September 1914 and continued into November. Historians continue to debate whether this was a literal race, or, as some scholars suggest, a series of tactical engagements that naturally extended the front northward without any genuine strategic flanking. What remains undisputed is the timeline and the consequence. Both sides attempted repeatedly to outflank each other by moving northward toward the English Channel. The First Battle of the Aisne, fought between September 13th and September 28th, 1914, marked a crucial turning point. This engagement, waged along the Aisne River Valley in northern France, saw something unprecedented in scale: the spontaneous creation of defensive earthworks. Soldiers faced with machine gun fire and artillery barrages began digging hasty field fortifications. What began as temporary protection evolved rapidly into something more substantial. Officers realized that prepared positions provided enormous defensive advantages against attacking forces. The improvised trenches at the Aisne River Valley were not yet the elaborate systems of later years, but they represented the birth of a new form of warfare. As the race to the sea continued through October and into November, both German and French forces, followed closely by British units, pushed northward in a series of engagements and maneuvers. Each side hoped to find that crucial moment when they could turn the enemy's flank and achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them on the Marne. Instead, what they found was that as soon as one army moved to outflank, the other would extend its line to prevent that maneuver. The front expanded northward like an accordion, stretching across the landscape of northern France and Belgium. The terrain over which this desperate competition unfolded varied dramatically. In the south, near the Swiss border, the landscape presented rolling hills and forested areas that offered some opportunities for maneuver. Moving northward, the terrain flattened into river valleys and coastal plains. The Meuse River and the Aisne River presented natural defensive lines that both armies attempted to control. Near the coast around the Belgian city of Ypres, the terrain became increasingly waterlogged and difficult, with poor drainage and frequent flooding that would later make any major offensive an engineering nightmare, as well as a military undertaking. Weather conditions during the autumn of 1914 added another layer of difficulty to the campaigns. The temperate oceanic climate of northern France and Belgium brought increasing rain and mud as fall progressed. Soldiers who had marched in relatively good conditions during the summer now found themselves struggling through mud and rain. Trenches began to fill with water. Supply lines became increasingly unreliable. The romantic notion of cavalry charges and grand maneuvers gave way to the grim reality of men digging in the mud, preparing defensive positions they hoped would be temporary, but increasingly suspected might become permanent. By October 19th, 1914, both sides had reached the North Sea coast. The maneuvering phase was over. The continuous trench line stretched approximately 450 miles from the coast near Dunkirk in Belgium southward through northern France to the Swiss border near Basel. What had begun as a strategic plan for rapid victory had become a static line of entrenchments. Neither side had achieved the decisive breakthrough. Both had instead created the conditions for a new kind of warfare that none of them had fully anticipated or prepared for. The soldiers themselves began to understand what was happening. Letters and diaries from the period reveal a gradual shift in perspective. Men who had enlisted, expecting a short war, began to contemplate the possibility of years of conflict. Officers struggled to adapt their training and tactical doctrine to conditions that did not match anything in the military manuals. The improvised trenches that had begun at the Aisne River Valley were becoming more elaborate, more permanent, more extensive. Barbed wire, which had been used in previous colonial conflicts, but never on such a scale, began to spread across the landscape between the lines. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had solidified into something that would define the next 4 years of warfare. The race to the sea had ended, not with victory for either side, but with stalemate. The trench lines established during those desperate autumn months would barely move for over 3 years. What had begun as an attempt to achieve rapid, decisive victory through maneuver had become the foundation for attritional warfare on a scale the world had never witnessed. The origins of the Western Front lay not in careful planning, but in the failure of careful planning, in the desperate improvisation of commanders and soldiers, confronted with a situation that no one had truly anticipated, for which military doctrine offered no adequate solution. The Marne changed everything. When the German armies pulled back from the gates of Paris in September of 1914, they did not retreat in defeat so much as in recognition of a fundamental miscalculation. The Schlieffen Plan, that elegant mathematical apparatus that had promised victory in 6 weeks, had failed. The margin of that failure was narrow, mere kilometers. But in warfare, narrow failures become catastrophic consequences. General Helmuth von Moltke, the German chief of staff, understood this immediately. On September 5th, as his armies wheeled back from the Marne River after 5 days of brutal fighting, Moltke reportedly told the Kaiser that Germany had lost the war. He was not yet proven right, but his pessimism captured an essential truth. The moment for quick victory had passed, and what remained was a race against time itself. The Battle of the Marne, fought from September 5th through 12th, 1914, had killed or wounded over 400,000 men across both armies. The French and British had not defeated the Germans so much as they had held them, and in holding them, they had shattered the German strategy of rapid encirclement. The German First Army under General Alexander von Kluck, which had been racing toward Paris with the expectation of victory, found itself halted and then forced to retreat. But the retreat was not a collapse. It was a tactical withdrawal. And from that withdrawal emerged a new and terrible logic. If rapid victory was impossible, then the armies would have to dig in and prepare for a long war. Neither side truly understood what they were about to create. The concept of trench warfare as a dominant strategic form did not exist in military doctrine. Trenches were emergency measures, temporary fortifications, used when armies needed to rest or regroup. No one imagined that within weeks, these emergency measures would become permanent, and that within months, they would stretch from Switzerland to the sea. Yet that is precisely what happened during the race to the sea, the series of engagements and maneuvers that unfolded from September through November of 1914. After the Marne, both armies moved northward with the same objective: find an open flank. The Germans wanted to reach around the left side of the British Expeditionary Force and the French armies. The British and French wanted to do the same to the Germans. It was not truly a race in the conventional sense, though historians have long debated whether to call it one. Some scholars argue that the term race to the sea is misleading, that what actually occurred was a series of tactical engagements that naturally extended the front northward without either side achieving the decisive flanking maneuver they sought. Others maintain that both commanders understood the strategic stakes and were genuinely competing to reach the coast first and establish an unbreakable position. The truth likely lies between these interpretations. Both sides understood they were racing, but neither side clearly understood what they were racing toward. The First Battle of the Aisne, fought from September 13th through 28th, 1914, marked the moment when the nature of the war fundamentally transformed. The Aisne River Valley, with its steep banks and natural defensive positions, seemed ideal for armies trying to hold ground against pursuit. German forces dug in along the high ground north of the river. British and French forces attacked across the valley. The battle was ferocious and costly, and by its end, both sides had lost over 80,000 men. But more significantly, both sides had discovered something unexpected: that soldiers with spades and barbed wire could hold against soldiers with rifles and bayonets. The trenches at the Aisne were not the deep, elaborate systems that would characterize the Western Front by 1916. They were rough, hasty affairs, often no more than a meter deep, frequently waterlogged and constantly vulnerable to collapse. Yet they worked. They protected soldiers from artillery fire and machine gun bullets. They allowed defenders to concentrate firepower at points of attack. And once soldiers had dug them, they seemed reluctant to leave. Why advance across open ground into enemy fire when you could stay in your trench and shoot at enemies who advance toward you? From the Aisne, both armies continued their northern movement. The Germans tried repeatedly to find the open flank that would allow them to break through. The British and French tried to do the same. Neither succeeded. Instead, as each army moved north and dug in, the other army had to move north and dig in as well, to prevent being outflanked. It was a process that repeated itself again and again, like two dancers unable to separate, moving together across the map of northern France and Belgium. The First Battle of Ypres, fought from October 19th through November 22nd, 1914, represented the climactic moment of this process. Ypres was a medieval city in Belgium, a place of no particular strategic importance except that it sat at the point where the British Expeditionary Force and the German armies confronted each other in open country. Both sides poured reinforcements into the salient around Ypres. Both sides attacked and counterattacked with increasing desperation. The fighting was savage and exhausting. Young soldiers, many of them reservists and newly mobilized troops, fought in conditions they had not imagined during their training. October rains turned the Flemish countryside into a muddy morass. Artillery fire churned the ground. Machine guns mowed down infantry advancing in waves. The casualty figures were staggering. The British Expeditionary Force lost over 86,000 men at Ypres alone. German casualties were comparable. Yet the lines barely moved. When the battle finally ended in late November, neither side had achieved breakthrough. Instead, both sides recognized that further major offensive operations would be suicidal. The armies had reached the North Sea coast, and there was nowhere left to go. The race to the sea had ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. By the end of November 1914, the Western Front had assumed its essential form, a continuous line of trenches and fortifications stretched for approximately 450 miles from the North Sea coast near Dunkirk, Belgium, southward through northern France, along the Aisne and Meuse rivers, and finally ending at the Swiss border near Basel. This was not a single line, but a complex system of trenches, barbed wire, machine gun emplacements, and artillery positions. Where the armies had stopped, they had dug in. Where they might be attacked, they had prepared defenses. The landscape itself had been transformed by the needs of war. What neither side had fully grasped was that this arrangement was not temporary. Soldiers wrote home expecting to return to mobile warfare, to the kind of war they had learned about in military academies and read about in history books. Officers submitted plans for offensives that would break through the enemy lines and restore movement to the battlefield. Politicians spoke confidently about victory in the spring, but the trenches would not go away. Every attempt to break through them would add more trenches, more barbed wire, more fortifications. What had begun as emergency measures would become the permanent reality of the Western Front. The transformation from improvised field fortifications to deliberate trench systems happened gradually but inexorably. In the autumn of 1914, soldiers dug trenches because they needed protection. By the winter of 1914, soldiers were digging trenches because that was what soldiers did. Support trenches appeared behind the front lines. Communication trenches connected the various positions. Dugouts provided shelter from artillery fire. Latrines, supply dumps, and medical stations were established. Entire cities of underground fortifications began to take shape. The technology of trench warfare evolved rapidly. Barbed wire, which had been used in colonial conflicts and the South African War, became an essential element of trench defense. Early wire entanglements were crude and often ineffective. But soldiers and engineers experimented, learning how to place wire, to channel attackers into killing zones where machine guns could concentrate fire. Machine guns themselves, which had been viewed as secondary weapons before the war, proved devastatingly effective in the defensive role. A single machine gun position, properly sighted and protected by trenches, could kill hundreds of attacking soldiers. The human cost of this transformation was immense. The armies that had marched into Belgium in August, with bands playing and crowds cheering, had suffered nearly 1 million casualties by the end of 1914. The British Expeditionary Force, which had entered the war with fewer than 100,000 troops, had lost over 86,000 men in the First Battle of Ypres alone. The French had suffered over 600,000 casualties in the first 5 months of the war. German casualties were comparable, and this was only the beginning. The trenches would remain in place for more than 3 years, and the casualty count would rise exponentially. The soldiers themselves struggled to understand what was happening to them. Letters home from this period reveal a growing awareness that the war would not be brief. A British officer wrote in October 1914 that he had begun to believe the war would last for years, not months. French soldiers reported that their officers had ordered them to prepare for a long winter in the trenches. German soldiers, initially confident of victory, began to express doubts about whether the war could still be won. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan had profound consequences that extended far beyond the military sphere. Politically, it meant that Germany could not achieve the quick victory that was essential to its strategic position. Germany's economy was not structured for a long war. Its resources, though substantial, were finite. The British naval blockade would slowly strangle German trade and industry. Over time, the advantage would shift toward the Entente powers, particularly as the United States eventually entered the war. But in the autumn of 1914, these consequences were not yet apparent. What was apparent was that the war would not be brief, and that millions of soldiers would have to endure the trenches. The stalemate that emerged from the race to the sea was not the result of any single factor, but of multiple reinforcing causes. The defensive advantages of trenches and barbed wire and machine guns proved greater than anyone had anticipated. The attacking advantages of artillery and numerical superiority proved less decisive than expected. Commanders on both sides had been trained in an era of mobile warfare and cavalry charges. The reality of trench warfare, with its emphasis on holding ground rather than gaining it, required entirely new tactical approaches that had not yet been developed. Most fundamentally, the armies had reached a point where neither side could break the other without suffering casualties so catastrophic that victory would be indistinguishable from defeat. As 1914 drew to a close, the Western Front had become what it would remain for the next 3 years. A 450-mile line of trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery that neither side could break and neither side could abandon. The race to the sea had ended not with victory, but with stalemate. The crisis that both sides had feared, a long war of attrition, had become the inescapable reality. Millions of soldiers would die in the attempt to move this line a few kilometers in one direction or another. No general breakthrough would ever be achieved. The war would be won not by maneuver, but by exhaustion, not by brilliant strategy, but by the slow grinding down of one side's capacity to continue. The Western Front, born from the failure of the Schlieffen Plan and solidified during the race to the sea, would define not just the war itself, but an entire generation's understanding of industrial warfare and its terrible human cost. By the autumn of 1914, the fundamental nature of warfare on the Western Front had transformed entirely. What had begun as a conflict of movement and maneuver had calcified into something far more terrible and permanent. The very concept of an open flank, the strategic holy grail that had driven both German and Allied commanders northward through September and into October, had become a chimera, a dream that dissolved the moment either side attempted to grasp it. The race to the sea, as historians would come to call it, did not end in victory for either side. Instead, it concluded with a shared, almost accidental discovery. The front had become unflankable. When both armies reached the North Sea on October 19th, 1914, they found themselves not triumphant, but trapped. The continuous trench line stretching approximately 450 miles from the Swiss border near Basel to the English Channel coast near Dunkirk represented something that neither commander had anticipated or desired. It represented stalemate made permanent. In the weeks following the First Battle of the Ysen in mid-September, the nature of entrenchment had begun to change. What started as hasty field fortifications, shallow ditches dug by exhausted soldiers seeking protection from artillery and machine gun fire, had evolved into something more deliberate and organized. Officers recognized that these temporary defensive positions might need to endure longer than anyone had initially imagined. By early October, as the race to the sea continued its northward progression through the Aisne River Valley and into northern France and Belgium, the trenches began to acquire a permanence that shocked the high command. Lieutenant Ernst Junger, a German officer serving with the 73rd Regiment, recorded his observations of this transformation with clinical precision. In letters home and in the careful notes he kept during those autumn weeks, Junger documented how trenches evolved from simple rifle pits into complex defensive networks. Soldiers began constructing communication trenches to link forward positions to rear areas. Barbed wire entanglements proliferated, creating zones of death before the main trench lines. Dugouts were reinforced with timber and sandbags. The landscape itself was being re-engineered for industrial slaughter. What neither Junger nor his superiors fully grasped was that this process was happening simultaneously on both sides of the lines. German sappers were building fortifications, while French and British engineers constructed parallel systems directly opposite them. The two armies were not merely digging trenches. They were constructing mirror images of each other's defenses, each responding to the other's innovations in a deadly dance of tactical adaptation. The political consequences of this strategic stalemate rippled through the capitals of Europe with devastating force. In Berlin, the realization that the Schlieffen Plan had failed, that the war Germany had planned to win in 6 weeks would now extend indefinitely, provoked a crisis of confidence in the high command. General Erich von Falkenhayn, who had assumed command of German forces after the Marne, faced an impossible situation. The vast majority of Germany's strategic planning had been predicated on rapid victory in the West. Now, with the Western Front solidifying into a static line, Germany faced the very nightmare scenario its military theorists had warned against: a prolonged war of attrition on two fronts. In Paris and London, the mood was equally grim, though framed differently. The Allies had halted the German advance and had prevented the encirclement of their armies. Yet they too faced the prospect of an extended conflict with no clear strategic breakthrough in sight. British and French commanders had their own assumptions about the nature of modern warfare, assumptions that the race to the sea was already beginning to shatter. The notion that cavalry could break through enemy lines, that maneuver would decide battles, that the war might be won through a brilliant flanking movement, all these beliefs were becoming obsolete in the face of entrenchment and defensive firepower. The casualty figures from the race to the sea period, from September through November 1914, revealed the human cost of this transition from mobile warfare to static defense. The First Battle of the Aisne alone cost the Allies approximately 90,000 casualties and the Germans roughly 130,000. These were staggering losses inflicted not in a spectacular breakthrough, but in a grinding series of frontal assaults against increasingly sophisticated defensive positions. The pattern that would define the entire Western Front for the next 4 years was already establishing itself. Attacks launched with courage and determination, met by devastating defensive firepower, resulting in massive casualties for minimal territorial gains. The birth of what historians would recognize as true trench warfare tactics occurred during this period. As soldiers and officers adapted to conditions in the trenches, new doctrines emerged. Machine guns, which had proven devastatingly effective during the race to the sea, became the primary defensive weapon. Barbed wire became as important as the soldiers who defended it. Artillery took on new significance as the primary means of softening enemy positions before infantry assaults. The principle of elastic defense, allowing attackers to advance into killing zones before counterattacking, was beginning to develop. British and German soldiers, facing each other across no man's land in the Ypres salient and along the Aisne, began to develop an informal understanding of trench warfare. Officers on both sides recognized that human beings could not sustain the intensity of continuous combat. Rotations became necessary. Sectors of the line were held with reduced numbers of men, with larger forces held in reserve for counterattacks. The concept of the holding line, a position that could be given up if necessary, while reserves executed a counterattack, began to replace the older idea of holding ground at all costs. The environmental conditions of autumn 1914 added another dimension to the misery of the trenches. The temperate oceanic climate of northern France and Belgium meant rain and mud. As autumn turned to winter, the trenches filled with water. Soldiers stood in trenches that became swamps, their feet perpetually wet, vulnerable to trench foot and other diseases. The famous Christmas truce of 1914, which occurred along portions of the Western Front in December, was partly a response to these horrific conditions. Men from opposing sides, exhausted and demoralized by the futility of their situation, briefly laid down their arms and acknowledged their shared humanity. Yet the Christmas truce, moving as it was, also symbolized the tragedy of the moment. Soldiers recognized that they were locked into a stalemate, that neither they nor their commanders seemed able to break. The optimistic predictions of rapid victory had proven catastrophically wrong. The war that was supposed to be finished by Christmas 1914 would continue for 4 more terrible years, with the Western Front barely shifting more than a few miles in either direction, despite millions of casualties. The archaeological evidence of this period, the physical remains of the trenches, the artifacts left behind by soldiers, tells a story that official histories sometimes obscure. Excavations in the Aisne River Valley and throughout northern France and Belgium have revealed the rapid evolution of trench construction. Early trenches were shallow and irregular, clearly improvised. Later trenches dug over the course of autumn 1914 show increasing sophistication, proper drainage systems, deeper dugouts, more elaborate communication networks. The material culture of the trenches, spent ammunition, personal items, fragments of equipment, documents the daily reality of men adapting to conditions that no previous generation of soldiers had experienced. The strategic implications of the stabilized Western Front extended far beyond the immediate military situation. With rapid victory now impossible, the entire character of the war changed. Germany's advantage in interior lines and the concentration of force that had enabled the Schlieffen Plan to come so close to success became irrelevant. Instead, the conflict became a test of industrial capacity, economic resources, and the ability to sustain casualties indefinitely. In this competition, the Entente powers possessed significant advantages. Britain's naval blockade began to strangle German commerce. The United States, though not yet a combatant, became an increasingly important supplier to Britain and France. Germany's strategic position, which had seemed so favorable in August 1914, was actually deteriorating. The psychological impact on soldiers of the realization that the war would not end quickly cannot be overstated. Letters home from soldiers on both sides, preserved in archives throughout Europe, reveal a growing sense of despair and resignation. Men who had enlisted or been conscripted with the expectation that they would be home by Christmas now faced the prospect of years in the trenches. The initial idealism and patriotic fervor that had characterized the opening months of the war began to give way to a grim determination, mixed with mounting cynicism about the purposes and objectives of the conflict. By November 1914, when the race to the sea effectively ended with the stabilization of the line, the Western Front had become what it would remain until 1918, a 450-mile scar across the landscape of Western Europe. The trenches stretched from the coast at Dunkirk south through the rolling terrain of northern France, following the natural contours of the land, but ultimately determined by the positions where opposing armies had ceased their northward and southward movements. The line ran through Picardy, past the Somme River, down through the Champagne region, along the Aisne, and eventually into the forested areas of eastern France before reaching the Swiss border. This line would become the setting for the great battles of the next 4 years: Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, and countless smaller engagements that would grind down the armies and the societies that supported them. The tactics that emerged during the race to the sea, the reliance on artillery preparation, the coordination of infantry assaults with machine gun fire, the development of defensive depth, would be refined and elaborated upon, but the fundamental problem would remain unsolved: how to break through an entrenched enemy with defensive firepower that made traditional attacks suicidally costly. The legacy of the race to the sea was thus paradoxical. It had prevented catastrophic defeat for the Allies and had shattered the German hope for swift victory. Yet it had also locked both sides into a form of warfare that neither had anticipated and that neither seemed capable of winning. The brilliant maneuvers and cavalry charges that officers had studied in military academies proved useless against machine guns and barbed wire. The assumption that moral courage and aggressive spirit could overcome defensive firepower proved tragically mistaken. When the initial stalemate on the Western Front finally broke in 1918, it was not through the breakthrough of static defenses, but through the collapse of German will and resources under the weight of sustained attrition. The 100 Days Offensive of August through November 1918 achieved what 4 years of grinding warfare had failed to accomplish: the penetration of German defensive lines and the restoration of mobile warfare. Yet by then, millions had died and been wounded in the trenches that had first been dug during the race to the sea. The men who fought in those first trenches, whether German, French, or British, had unknowingly participated in a revolution in warfare. They were the first soldiers to experience industrial mass warfare conducted from fixed fortifications. They invented, often through desperate improvisation, the tactics and techniques that would define 20th century combat. The lessons they learned and the mistakes they made would be studied by military theorists for generations. The race to the sea, therefore, was not merely a military campaign that failed to achieve decisive results. It was the moment when warfare changed fundamentally. It was the boundary between the old wars of maneuver and the new wars of attrition. It was the point at which the promise of quick victory died, and the nightmare of prolonged slaughter began. The 450-mile trench line that stretched from the Swiss border to the English Channel by November 1914 was not just a military position. It was a monument to the failure of strategic imagination and the terrible cost of that failure in human lives and suffering. The race to the sea ended not with victory, but with the tragic recognition that neither side would win, only that both would endure an agony that no previous generation had imagined possible.